Dr. Buttery to the emergency room. Dr. Buttery to the emergency room.
Hello, Doctor. It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. What's it been, like 6 or 7 months now?
Just about, but it's good to have you back, because there's definitely a team that could use your help.
So I've heard. You want to bring in today's patient?
Today we have Team BDS. This French powerhouse stood at the top of Rocket League for 2 years, but when this season started, they didn't quite look like themselves, and they've been falling down the standings ever since. Symptoms include surprising upset losses, disappointing finishes in tournaments, and choking. Do you think you can help?
Well, it has been a really long time since I've done this, but I can never turn away a team in need. So, alright. Let me see what I can do. This video has honestly been a long time coming, because when you look at it, there probably isn't a single team in RLCS history that fell off as hard and as quickly as BDS did this season. They went from winning last year's World Championship, which was in all honesty the biggest and most impactful Rocket League tournament that has ever happened, to now not even being able to make it to a major this season. And just saying that they haven't made it to a major doesn't even properly illustrate how bad they've been. At the end of the winter split, they are now sitting in 9th place in the region in total points. And with only one split left to make up all the points that they've left on the table over the season, it's looking less and less likely that they'll even qualify for Worlds. So they won't even get the chance to defend their championship. So of course, the first question I'm going to try to answer is, how did this happen? If you know me in my videos, then you know we're going to take a look at the stats and gameplay examples to try to get to the bottom of this issue. Then after we've gotten an idea of what's going wrong, we'll try to figure out what some potential fixes are. Because I'd be a pretty bad doctor if I didn't. Like, can you imagine a doctor doing that in real life? Hey, so we ran some tests and it turns out you have a pretty bad virus that will need to be treated. So yeah, my job is done. Good luck out there. Yeah, no, I'm not gonna do that. So I'm gonna try to come up with a solution and I'll let you all be the judge on how good that solution actually is. So yeah, let's get into it. In order to get a full picture of what's going wrong with this team, we're gonna start at the beginning. And in this case, that means we're gonna go back to the RLCS X season. Because back then, Team BDS had one of the most dominant runs of form that we've honestly ever seen. They won 5 out of the 9 regionals, and for the 3 regional majors that they played in, since international majors weren't a thing because of the virus that will not be named, they won all 3. Then they ended up losing the final event of that season, the RLCS X Championship, to Team Vitality in what was a huge upset, but that still doesn't take away from how good this team was throughout the season. Out of the 13 total events in RLCS X in Europe, BDS had 8 wins. So in the fight between Team BDS and the rest of Europe combined, Team BDS won that fight by winning 8 events, while the rest of Europe only won 5. So it was complete domination, and when you try to look at what made this team so good, the easiest answer is to say everything, and yeah, that wouldn't be wrong. Statistically, they had the best offense and best defense in RLCS X, so they are good on both sides of the field. But in my opinion, it was their defense that set them apart from everybody else. They were just barely the highest scoring offense in the region, but they were the best defense by a much wider margin. A lot of teams have a great defense because they don't allow their opponents to get off many shots, and G2's been the best example of this for a long time now. Like ever since they picked up Chicago, which was over 4 years ago now. But other teams are great at defense because they're able to allow their opponents to take a lot of shots, but they withstand the pressure and don't let many of them turn into goals. And one of the best examples of that right now is honestly Team Secret, which would have been a crazy thing to say about a South American team not too long ago because we're so used to them being aggressive. But it's pretty rare for a team to be great at both of these things when they're on defense, and BDS was in fact one of these rare teams. They didn't allow their opponents to take many shots, and if they did manage to take a shot, it probably wasn't going in anyways. And the biggest reason for this team being so successful on defense was because of their reliable structure and everybody having a specific role that they preferred to do when their team lost the ball. And if you've been watching my videos for a while, then you've probably heard me talk about this multiple times at this point, but let's go through it one more time. Marc was always the player who would like to challenge opponents as early as possible when they had the ball, trying to shut down their possessions before they got started. And if he wasn't able to completely shut it down, then he would at least create a threat that the other team had to worry about, and would make their advance up the field that much more uncomfortable. This meant that he played almost none of his defense on the back end, and this showed up in the stats, because he had the 4th least amount of time spent in the defensive third, and the fewest saves out of all players in the region. Marc playing defense like this for BDS was really important, because he was the main reason that teams would struggle to get shots off against them. The other team would get the ball, and then boom, Marc is already right in their face before they even get a chance to get a possession started, let alone get a shot on target. Even if there is somebody else on the team who could possibly go for the ball, if Marc could go for it too, then he's always going. But since his teammates knew that he was going, then they would usually back off, and we would hardly see double commits out of them because of that. For Monkey Moon's role, he was the best offensive player on the team, so he would be the one to finish off BDS's possessions most often, whether it was through a shot or a turnover. But with him, it was almost always a shot. If it didn't go in, then he would take a wide rotation around the play so that two players wouldn't be in the same area when Marc dove in for his challenge. And if BDS was forced all the way back to their side, then he'd rotate straight into net and make saves on any shot that came in. And he was very good at doing this because he ended up being third in saves per game that season, despite BDS not allowing that many shots in the first place. This play is a good example of Marc and Monkey Moon sticking to the script. Marc just rotated all the way back to their half to get boost, so he's the farthest man back on the field right now. And Monkey Moon is next to the play when Astral has the ball, so he could cut in and challenge if he wanted to, but instead he uses his boost to get back to the goal faster so Marc can drive in from the other side of the field and take the challenge. Marc is farther away from the play, so this challenge takes more time. And since Astral knows he's coming, there's basically no way that Marc will actually win this challenge, because Astral's too good for that. But he doesn't have to. All he has to do is disrupt the play and get the ball off of Astral to make Monkey Moon's job easier. So when Astral flicks the ball over Marc, Monkey Moon is right there to hit the ball safely off to the side. And to drive home this point even more, when Marc drives back to the defensive side after his first challenge, he sees Shaw set with a bit of space on the ball, so he immediately cuts his rotation and goes in for another challenge, even though he's less likely to win this challenge than he was the first. Playing like that is probably really, really fun. And finally, you have Extra, who I thought had the hardest and most important defensive role on the team, being the proverbial second man most often. Marc Bayet would go in for his early challenges, and Monkey Moon would take wide rotations back to his net. But this meant that there would be times where there would be a huge space between these two players, and Extra would be the guy to fill that gap. After Marc challenged, if Monkey Moon was already behind him, then Extra would go in for a challenge too. But if Monkey Moon wasn't back there, then Extra would slow the play down by playing shadow defense and buying time for Monkey Moon to get back to goal, and then challenging when he finally does. This role is harder because there's a lot more nuance to his primary responsibility than either of his teammates. If Monkey Moon didn't get back in time, then Extra would have to be the player to make the save. Or sometimes he would have to recognize that even if he is the last man back during Monkey Moon's rotation, he might be presented with the chance to challenge the ball. And if he doesn't take that chance, then he'll be in an even worse position. Extra's primary responsibilities meant that there were a lot of decision points for him, and it seemed like he was always making the right one, which is a huge testament to his incredible awareness. So to summarize that entire section, BDS was the best team in Europe, and their defense was the biggest reason for that. But while their defense was the fulcrum of this team, their offense was still really good too. But as we transitioned out of RLCS X and into the 2022 season, things started to change a bit. After winning more than half the total events in RLCS X, BDS didn't win a single regional during the fall split of that season. And on top of not winning a regional, they only made it to the grand finals once, doing so in the first event before they were eliminated in the semifinals of the next two. But even after an online split that was really disappointing compared to their really high standards, they still went on to win the fall major anyways. So off of the strength of that win alone, many people were still fine calling them the best team in the world, which was probably the right call. If you win the first LAN that Rocket League had seen in 2 years at that point, then you deserve that title. But even with that win in the major, you could still tell that this BDS team wasn't the same team that they were in the previous season. Their finishes in the regional were one indication of their decline, but it became even more clear what was going wrong when you took a closer look at the stats. The defense had always been the strong point of this team, and in the 22 season, that defense stayed at the same high level, but their offense had started falling off a bit. They still had the best defense in the fall split of that season, but their offense had fallen all the way down to 11th place during the online regionals, and at the major, they were only 6 out of the 16 teams. Now 6 out of 16 isn't terrible, and with the defense they played, it was good enough to win the major, but it was still well below the standard they had set for themselves. And moving on past the fall major, if you looked at the scoring stats for the winter split as a whole, then you might have been tricked into thinking that their offense was improving, because in that split, they were second in goals per game, behind only Dignitas. And while that does sound really good, I don't think that was an indication of a turnaround, because in reality, that high scoring number was being propped up by a huge performance that BDS had in Regional 2, because in that single event, they averaged 2.5 goals per game, which was easily their highest scoring regional of that season so far. And it was also the 4th highest scoring regional that BDS had ever had to that point. So it's no coincidence that we saw BDS get their only regional win out of both the winter and fall splits of the 22 season in that regional. But one big performance isn't good enough to show that your offense is back. Because while one big performance is cool, you have to be consistent, and BDS didn't have that. In the other 2 regionals of that split, they didn't get over 2 goals per game, which is a number they used to hit all the time. To be exact, Team BDS averaged 1.76 goals per game in Regional 1, and they averaged 1.95 goals per game in Regional 3. And that 1.95 number is kind of decent, but it was also kind of a Mickey Mouse stat for them. And I'll let the little guy in the corner explain why. Then, going into the Winter Major, we saw BDS's offense hit a new low. Their defense was of course still really good, because they managed to finish the major with the fewest goals allowed per game. But on offense, they were only 9th out of the 16 teams there in scoring. And when they got knocked out of the tournament by FaZe Clan, they lost in a perfect sweep, losing game 1, 1-0, losing game 2, 2-0, and losing game 3, 3-0. Which is one, very funny, but it was also the final nail in the coffin that proved that Team BDS's offense wasn't good enough to cut it at the top level anymore. Now at this point of the season, Marc was getting a lot of blame for the team's struggles. And while some of the criticisms against him were pretty unfair, a lot of them were pretty justified too. But after this major, it couldn't be denied anymore that he was the main sticking point for this team's offensive shortcomings. He had very little impact on his team's offense, which was shown in the fact that he had the lowest goal participation out of all players of the event and the 4th lowest shooting percentage. So even if there was something good happening for BDS on offense, it probably didn't involve Marc. And then even when he did get the chance to make a positive play on offense, he probably wasn't getting it done. In fact, in just the last minute of game 1 against FaZe Clan, we saw him get a couple different chances to make a play, and he missed out each time. Here, he had a chance to pass the ball infield, with Extra sitting wide open in front of the net, and AJ sitting flat-footed in goal. But instead of taking that pass, he took a direct shot, which makes AJ's uncomfortable position work out perfectly. Now, to be fair, Marc had no boost when he made this touch, which did make it a bit tougher. But with Seikoo just missing the ball, I think Marc had enough time to adjust his approach as needed to get the ball to Extra. And if he does, then this is probably an easy goal. And then just a few seconds later, BDS is starting another possession. With plenty of space on the ball for Marc, and Monkey Moon running out ahead to wreak some havoc, this could turn into a really threatening chance. But then Marc rushes his touch, and he ends up whiffing the ball entirely, forcing Extra into a 50 instead. Marc does keep the ball in on that side of the field with another quick challenge, but this possession lost most of its life the moment Marc whiffed on that first touch. So at this point, BDS was very far away from the dominant team that they were in RLCS X. And while they were good enough to still make it to the majors without too much of a problem, that's not good enough for a team that was so used to being at the top of the region. So heading into the spring split of the 22 season, they decided to make a roster move to fix their issues. And it seemed like their main goal was to bolster this team's offense, because they replaced Marc by 8 with Seikoo, the rookie superstar who had taken the region by storm during his time with Endpoint that season. And when it came to improving BDS's offense, this move worked out perfectly. Like, it's kinda crazy just how good this move ended up being for this team's offense. So I just talked about the big performance that BDS had on offense in Regional 2 of the Winter Split. And in that event, they had 2.5 goals per game, which is very, very good. But in the Spring Split of the 22 season, BDS surpassed that number for goals per game in all 3 events. Their best offensive performance of the season before the roster move wasn't even as good as their worst performance after the roster move. Plus, out of the 4 highest scoring events that BDS has ever had, 3 of them occurred in the Spring Split of that season. Regional 1 was their highest one ever, Regional 2 was their 2nd highest ever, and Regional 3 was their 4th highest ever. And that includes the dominance we saw out of them during RLCS X. So I think it goes without saying that Team BDS led the region in goals per game during that split, but they also led the region in goals allowed per game too, meaning that they're back to having the best offense and the best defense, just like they did in RLCS X. But the main difference is that back then, their defense was clearly the strength of their team. But now, after bringing in Seikoo, their offense was now their biggest strength. And it's kind of funny because you could notice some differences in how this team played defense. I said before that Marc was the biggest reason why it was so hard for opponents to get shots off against BDS. And because of that, they were consistently at or very close to the top of fewest allowed shots per game. But now that Marc was on the bench, opponents were able to get a few more shots off per game than they used to. But since their allowed shooting percentage was still really low, thanks in large part to Monkey Moon and his great goal line defense, their overall defense was still really solid. Not to mention that since BDS was so good at creating their own opportunities, it was really hard for their opponents to break out and find good scoring chances of their own. So with their solid defense paired up with their rocket launcher of an offense, a lot of people expected BDS to come into the Spring Major and dominate the competition on their way to winning the tournament. But that didn't happen. In fact, it didn't even come close to happening. Because in what might be the most unexpected choke that we've ever seen in Rocket League, Team BDS got swept by Team Secret, and then they got swept by Pioneers to get eliminated from the tournament before they won a single game. So it got pretty ugly for them. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what went wrong here, because I already gave my thoughts on their performance in my video after the Spring Major. So check that out if you want the full story. But to summarize what I said there, Seikoo pretty much folded. It's not like he was the only person responsible for all of Team BDS's mistakes, but he was clearly the worst defender. He was missing touches on defense that led to easy goals, and he was missing scoring chances on offense that his team needed to take advantage of. And as a result, BDS looked like a completely different team compared to the one that was breaking scoring records and dominating the competition during the Spring Split Regionals. So after their stinker in the spring major, a lot of people were worried about their prospects of winning the world championship, and whether or not this team would actually be able to show up on land. But those concerns were quickly put to rest because, as I'm sure you know, BDS won the world championship, and pretty much all the mistakes that they made in the spring major were behind them. And Seikoo himself bounced back from his bad showing at the spring major to play well enough to earn the title of World Championship MVP. And while I thought that Monkey Moon deserved to win that award, I'm not too upset with Seikoo getting it instead. But now that we have all the historical context out of the way, it's time to finally take a look at this season's version of Team BDS, and it's time to figure out what's going wrong with this team right now. As far as how big the problem is, I'm not sure if it's even possible to over-exaggerate just how poorly this team has played so far this season compared to the standard they have set for themselves in the past. BDS hasn't made it to the top 4 a single time this season, so in total they've missed the top 4 in 6 regionals. In the previous 2 seasons before this one combined, BDS missed a total of 2 top 4s. So in the past 6 regionals, they've tripled the number of missed semifinals that they had in the past 18 regionals before that. And I think one of the toughest parts about it is that it hasn't been just one issue affecting this team throughout the season, but they've had multiple different issues that have sprung up at different times. The first issue that this team encountered in the fall split was that their excellent offense that carried them to the World Championship was nowhere to be found. They had by far the best offense in the European Spring Regional last season and in the main event of the World Championship. But now in the fall split of this season, their offense was extremely average, because they went from having the best scoring offense in the region to only the 8th best scoring offense, showing that this team's strength wasn't nearly as strong as it was before. And honestly, the main issue was pretty similar to what we saw them struggle with in the spring major, where they would create some scoring chances, but either a bad decision or a mechanical mistake would ruin that scoring chance before BDS could get anything out of it. It wasn't quite as bad as it was at the spring major, because that was really an all-timer, but it still wasn't great. In the fall split, BDS had the 3rd most shots as a team, but they also had the 6th worst shooting percentage, showing that they weren't converting nearly enough of their scoring chances. And the whole team had their fair share of struggles, so this wasn't on any one player. But it has to be said that it seemed like Seikoo was once again having the most trouble converting his chances. Individually, Seikoo had the 9th lowest shooting percentage that split, but he also had the 3rd most shots. When a player as good as Seikoo has that many chances to shoot, then you're going to have him convert more often than that if the team's going to have success. And the most frustrating misses were the ones where it seemed like it would be really straightforward, but then he would try to do too much, like this play against Quadrant in the Fall Open. After Extra and Cash fake each other out for the ball, Seikoo has a lot of space to take a shot, with only Ixo in a position to save it, because Cash is falling out of the play after the challenge, and Wave was still trying to rotate back, so Seikoo had a lot of the net to shoot at. And he has even more room for error on the shot when you realize that Extra fell forward into the net, so he's in a good spot to bump Ixo out of the way if he needs to. Just a simple shot with a decent amount of power would probably be enough to get BDS the goal. But instead of taking the simple shot, Seikoo goes for a double tap. Now he's good enough to make this type of shot, but it's still a lot harder than it has to be. And when he didn't hit the shot, the double tap took just a bit more time to develop, which gave Relating Wave the time he needed to get back into the goal and save Monkey Moon's follow-up, ending BDS's possession. And this missed goal ended up being huge, because Quadrant went on to win this Game 7 by a score of 1-0 in overtime. So this shot could have been the one to win BDS the game. And the problems weren't just limited to offense too, because their defense was just as shaky. They were in the middle of the pack for scoring defense, allowing the 8th fewest goals per game, which wasn't nearly good enough for them here, because they already had an average offense. So an average defense on top of that gives you an average team, which is exactly what BDS was. What hurt BDS on this side of the field was just general confusion in terms of who was supposed to be challenging the play at a given time. Whenever there was only one player in the area, then he would pretty much always go, no questions asked. But the confusion set in when multiple players had a chance to go for the challenge. Sometimes we would see a double commit when these situations came up, but it was even more common for us to see situations where nobody would commit and they would just give the opponent way too much space to work with. These situations almost never happened in RLCS X with Marc on the team, because if there's a situation when 2 players could go for the challenge and Marc was one of those players, then Marc was going every single time, because that's just what he did. And it made their defense a lot simpler because they never had to think about challenging or waiting. The decision was basically already made. But now the decisions were a lot more fluid, and without proper communication to fix it, their defensive structure would break a lot of times. And one of the best examples of that came in their final game of the fall split against Team Liquid. Monkey Moon makes the save, and Atto gets the ball up in the air, getting a flip reset on his first touch. And when he makes that touch, Extra's rotating back from the near post side after grabbing that corner boost, Seikoo is coming from the far post while his boost tank is nearly full too, and you have Monkey Moon covering the backboard with a boost tank that's about halfway full. So the net is pretty much covered no matter what. So now, all we need is someone to go challenge Atto and try to get the ball away from him. But he gets closer and closer to the net, and nobody on BDS is moving. Then, when he's eventually right in front of their goal, we finally see Extra and Monkey Moon jump at the ball at about the same time. But by then, it's already too late. Atto gets the ball past both of them using his flip reset that he still has, and while Seikoo initially makes the save, Atto easily dunks it in to get the goal for Liquid. In this scenario, I honestly think that there's a solid argument for each of the 3 BDS players needing to be the one to challenge. But that's not really the point here, because regardless of who you think should challenge, the point is that somebody has to, regardless of who it is. Even a double commit early on would be better than nobody committing, because at least a double commit would put some pressure on Atto. But with no one going until it was way too late, he was able to score an easy goal. Well, easy for him at least. So while the fall split was pretty bad, the season wasn't hopeless for them yet, because they still had 2 splits to turn things around and get back on the right track. But if they're going to do that, it would have to start on the offensive end. Because when this roster was at its peak, it was their offense that was driving them to victory. And we actually saw their offense improve immediately. After having the 8th best offense during the fall split, they jumped all the way up to having the 2nd best offense during the winter split, being behind only Carmine Corp, because of course they have the best offense. BDS's goals per game increased by over half a goal, and Monkey Moon might have been the biggest factor in this team's bounce back on offense. Throughout the winter split, he was 2nd in Octane rating, behind only Stizzy, who played in far fewer games, so his sample size was a lot smaller. But Monkey Moon led the region in goals per game, he was 5th in saves, and he was also in the top 10 in assists too. So he was making his presence felt in every area of the field, which is just typical Monkey Moon stuff. But it would also be very unfair to give him all the credit for the offensive turnaround, because Seikoo is playing really well too. Monkey Moon might have been 2nd in Octane rating, but Seikoo wasn't too far behind because he was 6th. Whenever Seikoo's in a slump, the first thing that suffers is his efficiency. And while it still wasn't great during the winter split, it was a lot better than it was in the fall. And since he took the most shots out of any player in the region, any uptick in his scoring percentage is going to be noticed. But the thing that sticks out most about Seikoo's stat line this split is that he was 3rd in assists per game. And if you only include players that appeared in a minimum of 20 games, then he was 1st. Now a lot of these assists came from a teammate following up on a shot that he took that didn't go in, but Seikoo still deserves most of the credit for a lot of the assists that he got. Whether it was Seikoo making a great pass to a teammate, or when he made a threatening solo play to crack open the defense and make his teammates follow up really easy. So I don't want to sound like I'm trying to discredit Seikoo, because he did a lot of work on offense. But even with this improvement that we saw from BDS, there was still a pretty big problem. They were still losing a lot, and they were actually losing even more than they did in the fall split. Because in the fall, they made it to the top 8 twice, and they only made it to the top 8 once in the winter, on top of having a lower win percentage in overall games. So what's the deal? Well, you might have noticed that all the improvement I talked about from this team this split involved their offense, and in particular, the offense from Monkey Moon and Seikoo. But I didn't mention anything about their defense, and that's because the defense wasn't going well at all. In fact, it was much worse than what we saw from them in the fall. So all the improvement that they saw on offense was offset by the downfall of their defense. They went from having the 8th best scoring defense in the fall to falling all the way down to 12th place in that stat in the winter. And with the team allowing a similar number of shots in both splits, the increase in goals allowed was almost entirely because of a higher allowed shooting percentage. A lot of the issues were the same thing that we saw in the fall split, like double commits when 2 players were in the same position to challenge, or the whole team being slow to challenge in other cases, which would then give their opponents too much space. But there was also another issue that was becoming more and more prevalent as the season went on. Monkey Moon and Seikoo are often heavily committed to the offensive side, and when they leave, they like to take wide rotations around the play to get back to their net. But when they both do this at the same time, without Extra being there to cover for them, it would give opponents a lot of space in transition, which would then turn into a lot of goals conceded. This is where Extra provides most of the value for his team. Extra isn't as involved on offense as his teammates, but instead, he makes most of his impact on defense, being the player that does all the dirty work and stopping the opponent's transitions by playing shadow defense to buy time for his teammates' rotations back, or by challenging immediately if the moment calls for it. Like I said before, filling this role on defense is really hard because of all the decisions you have to make, and making the wrong one pretty much always creates a scoring chance for the other team. Having somebody like Marc on the team made things a little bit easier for Extra because Marc would make the opponent's possession uncomfortable, and with the other team unsettled like this, it was easier for Extra to corral them into the position that he wanted them to be in. But now that Marc's gone, and with Monkey and Seikoo taking wide rotations back to net most often, there are now a lot of times when Extra needs to fend off the opponent's transition by himself, while they have all the room in the world to work with. This wasn't a problem when BDS was killing everybody with their offense, because it was so hard for their opponents to break out a defense and create viable scoring chances. But now that their offense was a lot more inconsistent this season, these opportunities were coming up more often. And with Extra having this much responsibility on him in these difficult situations this often, he was honestly struggling to hold up, because we started seeing more and more mistakes out of him whenever he was in the third man spot as the season went on. And by the end of the split, the mistakes started piling up to the point where even if he was in a position that seemed pretty straightforward, he was still at risk of messing it up and conceding a goal. Here, after Exotic blocks Monkey Moon's attempt to keep the ball in their offensive half, Extra is the last man back, with both of his teammates trying to rotate back to defense. And he has a couple of options here. The most aggressive option would be to go for the ball immediately while Exotic is still recovering. From there, he could get a hit to send the ball back into the opponent's half, probably using the sidewall to double tap it, or maybe even pinch it to get the ball over there. But this option is really risky, because since Extra is the last man back, if this touch doesn't go well, then BDS is in some trouble. So the more conservative option would be to just stay pretty close to the ball while turning away from it so he can play shadow defense on Exotic after he gets back into the play. And if Extra does a good job at that, which he pretty much always does, then this would slow the play down enough for Monkey Moon to get back into goal and would keep BDS in a much safer position. This is a decision that we've seen Extra make over and over again throughout the course of his career, so there was no reason to think he wouldn't do that again here. But instead of doing that, after some slight hesitation, we see him dive in for the challenge. But because of his hesitation, by the time he dives in, it's already too late. Exotic has finished his recovery, and he beats Extra to the ball, giving him a wide open net now that Monkey Moon can't get back in time to contest him. And then of course he finishes off the goal. We used to never see plays like this out of Extra, but after 2 splits of being put in really tough positions like this over and over again on defense, he was starting to second guess himself at what he does best. And plays like this showed that BDS's rock was finally starting to crumble. So now, we're finally caught up to the present, with BDS in the middle of their slump and their season on the brink. So it's finally time to ask the question, what should they do to fix this? Now of course this is a really hard problem to solve, because if it was easy, then they would have figured it out by now. But I'm still going to try to give it a shot. So first of all, we gotta find some way to get some consistency out of Seikoo. When he's at his peak, he's one of the best players in the world. And we saw him prove that during all of last season, except for the spring major, and he even started looking like himself again during the winter split of this season. But while Seikoo's highs are pretty high, his lows are just as low. And we saw him hit those lows during last season's spring major and again during the fall split of this season. So for BDS to be the team we expect them to be, we need Seikoo at his peak as often as possible. But figuring out how to get him to hit those peaks is a lot harder. I went through a lot of replays and a lot of stats putting together this video, and I was honestly struggling to find any correlation between what made Seikoo play well and what made him play poorly. From what I saw, it seemed like he got the same opportunities in both scenarios, and sometimes he would be hitting everything, and other times it seemed like he couldn't hit water if he was in a boat. And honestly, I don't really think there's a way to adjust the game plan to make Seikoo shoot better. It's kind of like a basketball player that's in a shooting slump. You can design plays to give him an open look, and try to put him in a position to succeed, but if he's not hitting the shots, then there's not much else you can do about it. So it seems like the best course of action here is to figure out what the mental block is for Seikoo's slumps, and try to get that out of the way. But doing that is above my pay grade. So you probably need somebody like Prof for something like that. If you'll allow me to throw out some complete conjecture for a second that absolutely should not be taken as fact. Actually, let me say that again and put it on screen so you know I'm serious. This should not be taken as fact. But I remember a while back I was listening to somebody talk about BDS, and they mentioned how Monkey Moon was demonstrably upset every time one of his teammates made a mistake. And I know from experience that seeing and hearing a teammate react like this whenever you make a mistake makes it a lot harder to bounce back, and mistakes can start piling up on each other because of that. This is something that we saw out of Marc when he was on this team, because when he made one mistake on offense, we would often see that followed up by 2 or 3 more. And now we're kind of seeing the same thing out of Seikoo, where if he's playing poorly for a little bit, then he ends up playing poorly for a long time, and it seems like it's really hard for him to bounce back. So maybe this is a real issue, or maybe I'm just talking out of my butt. But the point stands that somehow, some way, we need to see Seikoo be consistent. The second recommendation is that they need to come up with some kind of system on defense to help ease the communication issues when they have multiple people near the ball, while also focusing on closing off the space that opponents have when they get the ball to try to make things a little bit easier on Extra when he's back in the third man spot. Even with the defensive mistakes that we've been seeing out of him recently, I still believe that he's one of the best defenders in the world, but they need to start putting him in better positions for him to succeed. It doesn't matter how good you are at defense if you keep getting put in 2v1 scenarios when the opponents have all the space in the world to work with. I don't think there's a single player in the world who would be able to stand up to that over and over again without eventually folding, and Extra's no exception. Now the defensive structure that they come up with doesn't really matter as long as it works for every player on the team and they run it effectively. They could run it by player like they did when they had Marc by 8, where if one player's in a scenario, then he'll do one thing, while the other players put their focus into doing other things. But if having the individual roles set up by player doesn't work, then maybe they could have a system where each player's primary responsibility is determined by where they are on the field. And I think the best team to emulate if you're going for something like this is probably Carmine Corp. All three of those players are very well rounded, and it seems like they switch up their primary responsibility on the fly as needed. But regardless, for Team BDS's case, they need to figure out some system to fix the miscommunications they've been having. Now for the next thing that I want to say about this team, it's really just that Monkey Moon's kinda doing a good job. I always reach this point in my Dr. Buttery videos where I get to one player who I don't have many notes on. For my Team Envy video, Mist was that player, and for NRG, that player was Justin. And now here, that guy is Monkey Moon. Now this isn't to say that he's a perfect player or whatever, but fixing his issues isn't really an individual thing, but it more so ties into the second point that I made of trying to fix their system. Because their defensive scheme is failing them right now, and Monkey Moon is of course a part of that. But as far as the plays that he's making individually, honestly he's pretty much good. So don't let him get poached by like Vitality or something, I don't know. And now for my last point, I'm kind of in a tough spot. In the last two videos I made like this on Team Envy and NRG, I didn't talk about any roster moves. Because one, I thought that all the team's issues could be fixed without one, and two, I didn't want people thinking that I was throwing somebody under the bus by suggesting one. But coming into this video, I told myself that roster moves are pretty much always on the table, and I should probably at least give some suggestion about how this team should go about it if they choose to go that route. So in this case, while I again don't think that a roster move is the answer, I was at least planning on talking about what the best potential moves are. And honestly, I thought over it for a long time, but like, I'm kinda stumped. The team right now is Monkey Moon, Seikoo, and Extra. If you're looking for a straight up talent upgrade over one of these players, then you would need to get somebody like Zen or Vatira or Alpha. And I highly doubt that any of those would ever happen. So even though I was planning on doing that, I really don't feel comfortable throwing out any potential roster move, because I don't think there's anything realistic out there that would help this team at all. So whether they like it or not, these guys are pretty much stuck with each other. For now, at least. Alright y'all, GG. After making so many recap videos back to back, it honestly feels really cool to dive deep on one team and do a full breakdown again. But let me know what you thought about it in the comments. Do you think I was spot on? Or do you think I was completely off base and that I'm stupid and should never talk about Rocket League again? I'm sure most of you fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, so let me know what your thoughts are. And finally, 1. Join my Discord, and you can find the link to that in the description. And 2. Follow me on Twitter, I guess? I don't know, Twitter kinda sucks now, so I don't really be on it like that. But I would still appreciate a follow nonetheless. And 3, you might notice that I added a little join button right there on my channel. So, you know, if you feel like showing your boy some love, then I would appreciate it. But yeah, I'm gonna get out of here now. So, of course, thanks for watching.